He saw the puppy hiding behind a dented trash can, barely more than skin and bone, shivering violently in the icy wind. It was the kind of cold that made even the pigeons disappear, and yet this little thing was alone, exposed, and silent. As Tom slowly approached, the puppy didn't bark or growl. It didn't even try to escape. Instead, it lifted one paw in the air and looked at him with eyes that didn't ask for help, but accepted defeat. Tom had walked this route behind the supermarket every morning since his wife passed away, mostly to keep moving, to avoid the silence in his house. He never expected anything to change. Life had settled into a dull rhythm of coffee, walking, and waiting for a night he could sleep through. But seeing that puppy, helpless and motionless in the cold, shook something loose in him that he thought was frozen for good. For a moment, he didn't feel numb, he felt afraid for something other than himself. The alley was quiet, except for the wind whipping between the buildings and the low whimper barely audible from the trash can's shadow. Tom crouched slowly, careful not to scare the pup, and noticed a gash on its leg, already crusted with dirt and dried blood. Its fur was matted and smelled of rotten food and urine, but those eyes held a kind of broken trust that was impossible to ignore. Tom reached into his coat pocket, unsure what he was doing, and pulled out the half sandwich he'd been saving for later. He placed the sandwich gently on the ground and stepped back, watching as the puppy hesitated, sniffed, then dragged itself toward the food without using its injured leg. It was hungry, starving even, but it moved like it had learned the world punishes sudden movements. Tom swallowed hard, the guilt rising like bile in his throat. Not because he caused this, but because he almost walked by. No one else had stopped. How many people had passed this alley and done nothing? Back home, the heater hummed in the background, but the emptiness pressed down on Tom like a weight he carried everywhere. He sat on the couch, the image of the puppy still burned into his mind. How it didn't flinch when he reached for it, how it looked right through him like it had already given up. He had once looked at the mirror the same way 2 winters ago, the night after the funeral, when the world felt just as cold. That night he didn't sleep at all. The next morning, Tom returned with an old towel and a can of tuna from his pantry, unsure if the puppy would still be there. He tried not to expect much. Animals don't wait for people, especially not people like him. But as he turned the corner, there it was curled tighter than before, barely breathing, the sandwich wrapper still beside it. This time, the puppy didn't move when Tom knelt down. Its eyes fluttered open, and he saw fear giving way to exhaustion. Tom wrapped the towel around the small, shaking body, surprised by how light it was, like holding a bundle of bones and air. The puppy whimpered once, then pressed its head against his chest as if it recognized something safe for the first time. Tom didn't cry easily, not even at Marie's funeral, but in that moment, his throat closed and his eyes burned with tears that came without permission. He had come to save the puppy, but it already felt like the puppy was saving him. He sat on the curb, cradling the injured pup while cars passed without slowing down, without noticing. Time seemed to pause there, in that quiet moment between strangers bound by pain. Tom didn't know what to do next. He hadn't thought that far ahead, but he knew he couldn't put the puppy down and walk away. Something in him had shifted, and the numbness he lived with for 2 years was replaced with urgency. This wasn't about pity, it was about purpose. As Tom stood, the weight of the puppy in his arms felt heavier than it should for such a small creature. He started walking not home, not back to his routine, but to the one place he hadn't visited in years, the animal clinic Murray used to volunteer at. With every step, his resolve hardened. He couldn't fix everything, not for himself, not even for the dog, but he could fix this moment. That was enough for now. The bell above the clinic door jingled as Tom stepped inside, drawing startled glances from the receptionist and a young vet tech behind the counter. He was out of breath, unsure what to say, so he just held the puppy out in front of him and said, "I think he's dying." The room fell silent as the tech rushed forward. Tom let go of the pup, watching as it was carried away, and stood there, hand trembling in the air, not ready to let go, but knowing he had to. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and fear, a mix Tom hadn't experienced since Marie's last hospital stay. The vet, a woman in her early 30s with steady hands and tired eyes, took the puppy without asking many questions. She laid it gently on the metal table and began examining the wound, her brow furrowing as she worked. Tom stood awkwardly by the door, heart pounding, feeling more like a witness than a participant in something deeply important. She glanced at him and said the leg might be fractured, possibly infected, and asked if he was the owner. Tom hesitated. That word owner hit something raw. He said no, not yet, but that he'd found it like this and couldn't just walk past. The vet nodded, used to these half-stories, and kept working while the tech shaved the fur around the wound and prepped a saline rinse. The puppy didn't fight, didn't whimper it, just watched the ceiling with eyes that had seen too much when they asked if he'd be responsible for the medical bills. Tom instinctively reached for his wallet, knowing there wasn't much inside. He hadn't planned on this. He lived on Social Security and small pensions, and even then, just barely. But the idea of leaving the pup behind in a cage, or worse in a shelter with no guarantees, made his chest tighten. He asked how much it would cost just to stabilize the dog, just to give it a chance. The vet gave a number that made his stomach drop, but her voice was kind, not demanding. She mentioned they had a fund for cases like this. Rescues, abandoned animals, but they needed someone to take responsibility. Tom stared at the form on the clipboard. His hand trembled as he signed his name, a decision landing with finality. He told himself it was just temporary, just until the dog recovered. But deep down, something told him that wasn't true. The days that followed became strangely full, every hour measured by visits to the clinic and updates from the vet staff. The puppy, who hadn't made a single sound since the first night, was now eating soft food and resting in a small, heated kennel. Tom came twice a day, sitting quietly beside the glass, whispering things he hadn't said to anyone in years. Sometimes he told the dog about Marie. Sometimes he just sat there in silence, feeling seen for the first time in a long while. When the staff started calling the dog his, Tom didn't correct them. He brought in an old blanket from home, one Marie used to drape over their couch, and left it with the puppy. The next time he came in, the little thing was curled up in it like it had always been his. That sight made something ache inside him in the best possible way. He wasn't just helping the dog anymore. The dog was helping him remember how to care again. His neighbors started noticing the change. The quiet man who never smiled now walked faster, talked more, and even waved. A few people asked what was going on, and Tom would shrug and say he was looking after someone small. He didn't give details. He didn't know how to explain that a dog he'd found in the trash was slowly stitching pieces of his soul back together. Some things couldn't be said out loud without breaking apart. Then came the call he didn't expect. The vet said the infection was worse than they thought, and the pup might lose the leg if they didn't act quickly. It would mean surgery, more money, more risk, but a chance to survive and live pain-free. Tom didn't hesitate this time. He didn't ask about the price. He just said, "Do it," and hung up the phone with his heart racing and his hands clenched tight. That night he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at Marie's photo, asking her silently if he was doing the right thing. He imagined what she'd say, how she used to bring home stray cats without thinking twice, how she believed every creature deserved love. The memory made him laugh and cry all at once. Maybe this was her way of reaching him again. Maybe the universe had left this little soul in his path for a reason. By the time the surgery was over, Tom was already planning how to adapt his apartment for a three-legged dog. He looked up ramps, orthopedic beds, even homemade treats. It wasn't about saving a dog anymore. It was about building a life around something that needed him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just passing the hours. He was living them. The morning after the surgery, Tom arrived before the clinic opened, standing in the cold with a paper cup of black coffee and a knot in his stomach. When the vet tech unlocked the door and saw him there, she smiled softly and said, "He made it through." Tom didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until then. The wave of relief hit him like a punch to the chest, and for a second, he just stood there, eyes closed, letting it wash over him. Inside, the puppy was groggy but awake, bandaged and doped up on pain meds, lying on a heated pad with one leg now missing. Tom crouched beside the kennel and whispered, "You're tougher than me." The puppy turned his head slowly, ears twitching at the familiar voice, and Tom felt his own throat tighten. The sight of that tiny creature surviving such trauma made everything else in his life feel strangely small and survivable too. Over the next few weeks, recovery became a rhythm. Tom learned how to clean bandages, how to support a wobbly body on short walks, and how to talk like everything was okay even when it wasn't. The dog who the clinic had started calling Scrap because he came from the trash began responding to Tom's voice with a slow wag of the tail. It was subtle at first, but it was real. Connection wasn't instant, but it was growing. Tom's apartment transformed along with the dog's progress. He cleared out clutter to make space, repurposed Marie's old reading chair into a cozy nook lined with blankets, and built a makeshift ramp for the porch steps. Every change he made for Scrap felt like a change he was finally making for himself. Life had stopped being something to endure. Now it felt like something he was building again, slowly, patiently, with purpose. Scrap's spirit returned in pieces. First came the appetite, then the bark, a tiny hoarse sound that startled Tom the first time he heard it. Then came curiosity, cautious exploration of corners and cabinets, tail wagging with more conviction. One afternoon, Scrap even tried to chase a squirrel, hopping clumsily before toppling sideways into a patch of dead leaves. Tom laughed, a full, unexpected laugh that echoed off the walls of the empty park. Neighbors started asking about the dog, about what had happened. Tom told them bits and pieces, always finishing with, "He's doing better than I ever expected." What he didn't say out loud was that he was doing better too. He didn't mention how the simple act of caring had cracked through years of grief, how the weight he carried for so long had shifted, not disappeared, but shared now between man and dog. His daughter, who lived 3 states away and rarely called, noticed the change in his voice when they finally spoke. She asked if he'd gotten a dog, and Tom told her about Scrap, about the leg, about the alley. There was a long pause on the line before she said, "It's good to hear you sounding like yourself again, Dad." That hit harder than he expected. It wasn't just a dog. It was a bridge between grief and healing, between silence and conversation. At the clinic's next checkup, the vet smiled as Scrap entered the room on 3 legs, tail high, ears up. "He's a survivor," she said, crouching to scratch behind his ear, "but he wouldn't have made it without you." Tom didn't know how to respond. He looked down at Scrap, who was now sitting proudly beside him, and simply nodded. The truth was, he didn't save Scrap despite everything. He saved him because of everything. Later that week, a local paper ran a story about the rescue. Veteran saves puppy found in trash. Both find new purpose. There was a photo of Tom and Scrap on the porch, sun setting behind them. Tom didn't like attention, but this felt different. It wasn't about heroism, it was about showing that even in broken places, something whole can begin again. The article brought flowers from strangers, handwritten notes, and even a few visitors. That Sunday, as Tom sat on the porch with Scrap curled beside him, he realized he no longer checked the clock waiting for the day to end. He watched the wind stir the trees, felt the weight of the dog's body pressed against his leg, and let the silence sit comfortably for once. It wasn't just peace, it was presence. For the first time in years, Tom wasn't just surviving. He was here. He was whole. Tom's mornings changed completely. Instead of quiet, empty walks to nowhere, he now had a routine. Scrap waited by the door, tail tapping rhythmically against the floor, eyes locked on Tom's every move. They walked slowly at first, Scrap still adapting to 3 legs, but each step felt earned. Strangers greeted them. Some even stopped to pet Scrap, who now welcomed touch with surprising gentleness. The apartment felt lived in again. Dog bowls on the kitchen floor, hair on the couch, muddy prints near the door, all signs of a life shared. Tom found himself talking out loud more, sometimes narrating his day to Scrap, who tilted his head like he was listening. In the quiet moments, Tom would reach down absent-mindedly to rest his hand on Scrap's back, grounding himself in that simple presence. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed touch, warmth, something living close by. One afternoon, Tom found Scrap pawing gently at Marie's old sweater draped over a chair. Instead of stopping him, Tom knelt down, held the sweater up, and let Scrap bury his nose in it. He didn't cry this time. He smiled. He whispered, "She would have loved you." Scrap licked his hand and curled up beside him, and in that moment, it felt like a blessing had passed quietly through the room. Inspired by the story in the paper, a local rescue organization invited Tom to speak at a small event. He didn't feel like he had much to say, but when he stepped onto the modest stage with Scrap at his side, the crowd leaned in. Tom talked about grief, about silence, about finding something worth waking up for again. He ended by saying, "I thought I rescued a dog. Turns out he rescued what was left of me." After the event, people approached him not with pity, but with recognition. Others had lost spouses, faced isolation, felt invisible. They thanked him for saying things they didn't know how to express. One woman pressed a photo of her late husband into his hand and said, "He would have done the same." Tom walked away that day with a box full of letters, and for the first time, he felt like his pain had a purpose. Scrap started drawing attention wherever he went, not just because of the missing leg, but because of his calm presence. Children adored him, seniors stopped to ask about him, and even those who usually crossed the street to avoid dogs stayed a little longer. Tom realized Scrap had become more than a companion. He was a symbol of second chances. The community began calling them the miracle pair, something that made Tom chuckle every time he heard it. One rainy afternoon, a teenager approached Tom at the park, eyes red, hoodie soaked. He said he'd heard about the dog and asked quietly if it was true that you could feel better, even after losing everything. Tom didn't try to offer platitudes. He just nodded, then said, "You won't be the same, but you can still be something good." He handed the kid one of Scrap's treats to give him. The boy smiled when Scrap licked his hand. The vet offered Tom a chance to volunteer at the clinic once a week, helping with intake and comforting scared animals. It wasn't much, but it gave him structure, a way to give back. Scrap came with him, becoming a sort of therapy dog for other rescues. Watching new animals relax around Scrap gave Tom a quiet pride. His dog had gone from discarded to healer, and in some ways, so had he. Their life wasn't flashy. It was simple. Shared meals, walks in the park, quiet evenings with the television low, and Scrap snoring at his feet. But every detail meant something now. Every bowl filled, every paw print left on the porch. Tom no longer counted days. He lived them. He didn't measure time by absence anymore, but by the soft presence of something that trusted him to keep going. He didn't just save a dog. He found a reason to open the door again, to speak again, to feel again. Scrap didn't ask for anything except a second chance, and in giving that, Tom had found his own. The world hadn't changed. Loss still lingered. But now, every morning when he clipped the leash onto Scrap's collar and stepped outside, he was reminded, healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens one small step, one small paw at a time.